Donald Trump is a disruptor. He promised to reshape the federal government. His rhetoric was about retribution and rooting out what he and his allies call the deep state, or what others call career specialized public servants. At 5 p.m. Eastern today, that's 5 hours from now, a new directive to freeze federal programs and grants will go into effect. The realities of that order will go far beyond what many people took away from his campaign promises. The White House is offering up very few details on the scope and the details of its order, so there is a lot we don't know. But there are some details we do know about the impact programs that are a part of this order, how it could impact Americans across the country. CNN's Tom Foreman will break some of that down. Tom.
Hi, Dana. You're right. We do not know a lot about this. From what we do know, until the White House specifies otherwise, is that millions and millions of people who voted for Donald Trump could be on the chopping block in these in some fashion. School breakfast and lunch programs, for example, are among the things that are being potentially impacted by this. Section 8 rental assistance, that's not just for poor people, but it's also for senior citizens. It is for disabled people. Title I education grants, that's to help struggling schools and struggling neighborhoods. That could be cut back on. Temporary assistance for needy families. State grants for childcare. Head Start, a program to help with the education of children up to the age of 5, not just their education, but also their mental health, their physical health, all the things they need to start off life in a productive way. Special supplemental nutrition programs for women, infants, and children. HUD's community development block grant programs. EPA grants to states and localities for clean water. All of these are potentially up for grabs here. In addition, there are advocates out there who are saying programs like suicide helplines, hotlines. You could have women who are abused by their husbands tonight and who go to a shelter and are told, you can't come in here because we can't be open because of this cut. Same could be true for homeless people out there. There are all sorts of programs out here that are potentially affected. Again, millions and millions of people, many of them the people who voted for Donald Trump. Maybe, Dana, they will not be affected, but the White House has so far refused to offer any details about what this really means. And yes, you can look at a program like Head Start. There was just a recent government study that said there are endemic problems there that need to be studied. Maybe that's what this aims at, is trying to solve all those problems. But until we have more details, Dana, all we know is that communities all across this country who may not think they're going to be affected literally within hours could be feeling tremendous impacts from what is being done.
Thank you so much. That is so important to lay out. And that is just some of what could be impact some of the people, some of the programs, some of the needs across the country and down to the most local of communities. Tom, thank you.
Welcome.
Now, whether or not Donald Trump or any president has the power to do what Tom just described, to freeze grants and programs approved by Congress and signed into law, that is an open question. What is not an open question is what the Constitution says about checks and balances and which body is in charge of how taxpayer dollars are directed to be spent. That is traditionally seen as a congressional prerogative. And that comes from Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7 of the U.S. Constitution. No money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law. In more common parlance, Congress has the power of the purse. Donald Trump and his allies clearly want to test this in ways that affect those many aspects of everyday American life. I'm lucky to be surrounded here by a talented group of reporters to help break all of this down. CNN's Phil Mattingly, Kayla Gardner of Bloomberg, and Molly Ball of the Wall Street Journal. I have the benefit of seeing your emails, Phil Mattingly, trying to make us all smarter here at CNN. So why don't you impart that to our viewers?
Can I actually start by taking a step back for a second?
Please.
Because I think it's important to watch what's been happening over the course of the last 7 or 8 days and not think that these things are happening in isolation, right? And this is a really good example of it. Donald Trump campaigned on impoundments, campaigned on being able to take away Congress's power of the purse if he didn't think that's wild. That he's campaigning on something that is illegal because of a 1974 law signed by Congress that banned presidents from withholding congressionally appropriated funding. He campaigned against that and said explicitly he was going to do it. His nominee to be budget director, was on Capitol Hill testifying just a few days ago, saying he agreed with the president that this thing that is law is unconstitutional.
They want to test it.
They want that fight. And so when you see things like the birthright citizenship executive order, they want that fight. They know that that fight is coming, and they believe, based on the reality that currently surrounds them, which is so dramatically different than it was in 2017, that they can win that fight. And if they don't win that fight, there will be no other repercussions other than they just get it struck down. There are no lawmakers on their side of the aisle, which they hold both majorities of the House or of Congress, that are going to fight them on this or punish them for what they're doing, which is wild, by the way, that appropriators on the Republican side are not going bonkers right now. Chairwoman Susan Collins hasn't put out a statement yet. It's wild to me. They believe that the courts, particularly in the wake of what the president did in his first term with the circuit court judges and the 6-3 Supreme Court majority, largely is a very different environment than they were facing in the first term. They want the fights, and they're willing to not just wait and see, like, this is the process, we're not supposed to do this, we'll wait and see how this happens, maybe we'll get there after we try everything else. No, they're doing it now, right off the bat, because they want the fight.
I'm so glad you said that. I want everybody to clip and save and send that around, because what you just said is critical to the way that we need to approach this. Number one, we are starting with real people, and whether they want the fight or not, whether they want to make a constitutional or a legal point or change the way that all of this is done, that is clearly what their goal is, as you just laid out. In the short term, though, a lot of people, including those who voted for him, are struggling with how this memo, which I'm just going to read part of it, how this memo affects their communities, whether it's firefighters or local law enforcement, never mind the food and sustenance that a lot of people who are in need get from these federal programs. Okay, the memo. Let's just talk about where this came from. This is the memo that went out overnight. Federal agencies must temporarily pause all activities related to obligation or disbursement of all federal financial assistance, including but not limited to financial assistance for foreign aid, non-governmental organizations, DEI, woke gender ideology, and the Green New Deal. First of all, just keep that up. The Green New Deal is not a thing. That is the law. At the beginning, I'm following. DEI certainly is a list of programs, but woke gender ideology, I mean, some of this is just MAGA Mad Libs.
Well, I mean, I think that the administration would argue that many of the policies the Biden administration implemented amounted to codifying what they would term woke gender ideology. Certainly the Biden administration had executive orders enshrining rights for transgender people in the executive branch. And the same with the Green New Deal. They would argue that the aspects of the Inflation Reduction Act, which was actually a big spending bill for green energy, was a sort of backdoor Green New Deal.
Which was passed by Congress. Right.
But which was implemented through the executive branch in various ways. So it's not just MAGA Mad Libs. I mean, if it were, it wouldn't have any effect, right? If there wasn't anything, it was actually.
I guess my point is that the way it's written, it does seem to be intentionally vague, and to intentionally not entirely clear to the people who are trying to figure out, again, on a local level all across the country right now, if the programs that they are involved in that help their local communities are still going to be functioning at 5 o'clock. It's that plus sending a message to the base with the language that they're using.
Absolutely. And look, I mean, the effect of this on the civil service, on the existing employees of the executive branch is like a bomb went off. And as Phil was saying, that's intentional.
Yeah.
The point is to put the fear of God in a lot of these civil servants. The point is to give latitude to a lot of the new political appointees and cabinet heads that Trump is installing, to give them the room to operate, to root out all of the things that they see as problems in all of their different agencies and departments. And I think what remains to be seen is how does this all go over with the American people? How do people like it? There was a surprising finding in our Wall Street Journal poll a couple weeks ago. We asked people whether they supported the president getting rid of thousands of civil servants to replace them with his own appointees. It was surprisingly unpopular. I would have thought that people don't like government bureaucracy, but actually only 31% approved of that and 61% opposed it. So the federal government is more popular than you might think, and I think it's going to take a little bit of going through this sort of shock and awe period before we start to get a sense of, are Republicans on Capitol Hill hearing from their constituents about this? Is there a widespread public backlash and uproar, or do people sort of look at this like a temporary government shutdown and things will get better afterwards?
Well, I think that clause that you mentioned, the including but not limited to, shows how vast this could be. OMB says the total funding that we're looking at is about $3 trillion, and we know that DOGE is targeting $2 trillion, and the thinking had been, if you don't touch Social Security, if you don't touch Medicare, which this clause says that it's not going to do, that they would never be able to get to that goal. And this shows that they're really willing to go outside of the bounds of what was previously thought as being on the table in terms of cuts to potentially get to that $2 trillion goal.